People often imagine that a film springs from a director's hands fully formed, carrying their voice from the first frame to the last. But in the action genre built on high-stakes, tight deadlines, and executives terrified of risk, the truth is far less romantic. Many movies take their final shape far from the set, in fluorescent-lit editing suites where the director's vision becomes negotiable. Here, decisions are made quietly, bluntly, and sometimes brutally, sculpting a cut the filmmakers never intended. For every action movie you've watched, there may be another version that once existed, darker, sharper, stranger, a cut assembled with intention, only to be dismantled when studio fears outweighed artistic conviction. Scenes vanish without explanation. Emotional beats dissolve. Entire themes disappear as if they never mattered. A story that once carried weight is trimmed into a product designed to feel safe, predictable, and profitable. And in the wake of those decisions, a director is left staring at a film that bears their name but not their identity. Some fought until the last hour. Some surrendered in silence. Others walked away completely, unwilling to take ownership of what had been reshaped behind their backs. And in the hollow spaces of those missing moments lies a second narrative, a hidden history of conflict no audience ever sees, where creative control is a fragile privilege, not a guarantee. This episode pulls back that curtain. It explores the films that were reworked without permission, the edits made in secrecy, and the alternative versions rumored to be locked away in vaults or lost to time. What emerges is a portrait of an industry where the cut you watch is not always the cut that was meant to survive. These are 15 action movies recut without the director's consent and the unseen shadows they left behind. Fact 1. The Glimmer Man. There's something uncanny about The Glimmer Man, a lingering feeling that the story is missing pieces it was never allowed to keep. Director John Gray once shaped a darker, more introspective film, one built around the fractured mind and haunted past of Jack Cole. But that version never made it beyond the editing room. The studio, uncomfortable with its somber tone and psychological weight, stripped away entire sequences meant to reveal the shadows trailing Seagal's character. Those flashbacks, those subtle emotional cracks, the unsettling violence tied to Cole's former life, they vanished before audiences ever saw a frame. Executives insisted the film needed to be more commercial, a phrase that often signals the death of nuance. They trimmed the narrative until it resembled a procedural thriller, cutting connective tissue, tightening pacing, and diluting atmosphere. What remained was an outline of Gray's original vision, scenes stitched together with the efficiency of an assembly line, but without the pulse that once animated them. Crew members have spoken quietly about the lost material, how it gave moral depth to the protagonist, how it clarified motivations that now seem abrupt. Yet no alternate cut has surfaced. No special edition. No leaked work print. Just whispers of a film that might have carried more emotional gravity if the studio had trusted its own director. The version that reached theaters wasn't simply a shortened cut. It was a dismantled one. Audiences didn't watch a reconstruction of Gray's vision. They watched its remains. Fact 2. Fire Down Below. At first glance, Fire Down Below appears to follow a straightforward formula. Seagal as a lone investigator exposing environmental corruption. But the film originally had a sharper edge, shaped by director Felix Enriquez Alcala into something closer to a character-driven thriller. His cut leaned heavily into investigative dread and the human cost of ecological devastation. Yet the studio, nervous that such themes were too weighty for an action star's vehicle, stepped in and began rearranging the film's bones. They removed scenes that showcased the suffering of the poisoned communities. Seagal's character sought to protect moments that grounded the narrative in anguish rather than spectacle. Dialogues revealing the intricacies of the corporate cover-up were cut for pace. Entire investigative threads disappeared, leaving the story streamlined but hollow, a simplified echo of the original intent. What survived were isolated bursts of action, disconnected from the deeper emotional stakes Alcala had designed. The director reportedly fought to preserve the film's moral tension, but the studio pushed for a more conventional rhythm. When the final cut screened, it resembled a stitched-together version of the truth, retaining the plot's outline but shedding its urgency. Critics later noted the tonal imbalance, unaware that the missing weight came from scenes audiences were never allowed to see. Alcala's original version remains unreleased, living only in crew recollections and production notes. The film that reached theaters wasn't softened, it was defanged. Fact 3. The Punisher 1989. The 1989 adaptation of The Punisher hides an absence so large it can be felt in every frame. the erasure of Frank Castle's origin story as director Mark Goldblatt intended it. His original assembly spent time inside Castle's grief, charting the trajectory from devoted family man to relentless vigilante. These scenes formed the emotional spine of the narrative until the studio cut them out entirely. Without them, the film opens not with tragedy but with action, leaving audiences to fill in emotional gaps the director had worked meticulously to construct. Goldblatt's version reportedly included meditative sequences, moral hesitation, quiet rage. The studio saw them as pacing issues. Their preferred version was lean, fast, and fit for international markets, where emotional density was considered expendable. The removal of Castle's family tragedy didn't just shorten the film, it altered its soul. Viewers were left with a character whose motivations felt implied rather than earned, despite the richness Goldblatt had originally filmed. For years, rumors circulated about an alternate cut. Eventually, rough work prints leaked grainy, unfinished, but revealing. These fragments showed scenes the theatrical version never acknowledged: Castle confronting his own emptiness, reflections on violence, a more human arc buried under the studio's revisions. Even in incomplete form, these glimpses demonstrated how deeply the recut altered the film's emotional geometry. Goldblatt has openly expressed that the released version wasn't the movie I made, and the Frank Castle the world met was only a shard of the man the director tried to reveal. Fact 4. Let's Get Harry. Let's Get Harry is one of those rare cases where a film's identity was altered so aggressively that its own director no longer wanted anything to do with it. Stuart Rosenberg began with a tense, character-focused story about ordinary men pulled into a brutal rescue mission, an exploration of loyalty, fear, and the moral cost of vigilantism. But the film that audiences ultimately saw was shaped not by Rosenberg, but by studio hands determined to create something more conventionally exciting. Executives trimmed away character-driven moments, removed emotional transitions, and pushed for a faster, more action-weighted rhythm. Additional scenes shot without Rosenberg's involvement were inserted to force a tone he never approved. By the time the studio locked the cut, the film's connective tissue had been severed, leaving behind a version that followed the plot but lost the psychological grounding that once defined it. Rosenberg was so displeased with the alterations that he requested to remove his name from the final product, hoping to credit the film under the industry's infamous pseudonym Alan Smithee. Although his request wasn't granted at the time, the gesture made his stance unmistakably clear. The theatrical cut wasn't his. For decades, rumors of Rosenberg's fuller, more introspective assembly have circulated, though no verified print has surfaced. What remains is a film that carries his name but not his voice, an example of how quickly a director's vision can be overwritten by decisions made far from the set. The version that hit theaters wasn't a reinterpretation, it was a replacement. Fact 5. Catch Fire. Few creative conflicts in Hollywood history are as openly hostile as the battle over Catch Fire. Dennis Hopper approached the project with a precise artistic intention, a moody neo-noir embedded with emotional tension, visual strangeness, and uncomfortable silence. His vision demanded patience, slow glances, extended pauses, and characters suffocating under their own desires. The studio, however, wanted momentum and clarity, two qualities Hopper had intentionally resisted. Executives seized the film during post-production, reworking entire sequences to accelerate pacing. They removed atmospheric moments that shaped character psychology, trimmed emotional beats that built suspense, and restructured narrative flow to produce a more digestible thriller. The music was altered. The tone was lightened. The moral ambiguity that Hopper prized was scraped away. What remained was a film assembled by committee functional, but stripped of the idiosyncrasy that made Hopper's original cut unique. His reaction was explosive. Hopper refused to accept the final cut and demanded his name be removed, choosing to credit the film under Alan Smithee, a pseudonym reserved for projects disowned by their directors. The gesture said everything the film itself could not. Later, Hopper released his own expanded cut, retitled Backtrack, which restored many scenes the studio had excised. It wasn't a perfect restoration, some footage had been lost, but it revealed a drastically different emotional core. The official theatrical release isn't just a recut. It's a rupture between two incompatible visions. Fact 6. Hard Target. John Woo's signature-style operatic action, flowing rhythm, and violence that borders on ballet was always going to collide with American studio sensibilities. Hard Target began as a fiercely stylized action film, one that leaned into Woo's Hong Kong sensibilities with long-form shootouts, emotional crescendos, and hyper-choreographed brutality. Universal, however, feared the MPAA's response and worried that Woo's intensity would push the film into NC-17 territory. Executives intervened, trimming gunfights, excising graphic impacts, and cutting transitional beats that shaped the emotional logic of the action. They tightened pacing until Woo's deliberate build-up collapsed into abrupt motion. Some sequences were re-edited entirely, reframing the story not through Woo's poetic violence, but through an American action lens that favored speed over atmosphere. Multiple cuts were tested: Woo's original, a compromised hybrid, and the studio's preferred version. Ultimately, the theatrical release leaned heavily toward the latter, smoothing out the very qualities that made Woo's filmmaking distinctive. The director pushed back, but with limited contractual authority, he watched much of his intended tone dissolve in the edit. Though certain international versions contain longer, harsher sequences, no fully restored Woo cut has ever been released. What remains is a film bearing his name but not the full force of his artistry. The final product stands as a muted echo of the storm Woo originally tried to unleash. Fact 7. The Expendables 3. The third installment of The Expendables was meant to be a bruising celebration of old-school brutality, aging warriors reclaiming their fire. But long before the film reached audiences, its edge was blunted in a strategic boardroom decision. The studio wanted a PG-13 rating, convinced that a softer cut would attract younger viewers and inflate box office revenue. The result was a sweeping transformation that reshaped the film's identity. Blood was digitally erased, gunshots softened, and key moments of violence trimmed until impact became implication. Emotional exchanges that once carried weight, confrontations, doubts, revelations were shortened or removed entirely. Scenes reflecting the emotional toll of aging mercenaries were hollowed out, turning layered arcs into faint gestures. Even the fight choreography was recut, altered not to enhance rhythm but to meet rating requirements. Stallone later admitted the decision undercut the film's authenticity. Insiders revealed that a harder, grittier cut existed early in post-production, a version with emotional bite and ferocious action. But it never reached the public. The theatrical release became a compromise, safer, smoother, and missing the violent honesty that defined the franchise. What fans sensed as something off wasn't imagination. The movie had been silenced before it ever had a chance to speak. Fact 8. RoboCop. 1987. Paul Verhoeven always intended RoboCop to be more than a violent sci-fi thriller. He designed it as a confrontational satire, using extreme brutality as a mirror to corporate cruelty. But when the MPAA reviewed the director's original assembly, they recoiled. The violence was deemed excessive, pushing the film toward an X rating. What followed was an editing battle that shaped the film's legacy. Murphy's execution was once longer, colder, and more devastating, a ritualistic dismantling of humanity. The ED-209 boardroom massacre was framed with absurdist excess, highlighting the utter lack of empathy within the corporation. These choices weren't gratuitous, they were thematic, but to the ratings board, they were unacceptable. Verhoeven and his editors were forced to trim shot after shot, blood spurts, lingering frames, reaction beats until the MPAA finally relented with an R rating. For years, audiences only saw the softened version, unaware how much emotional and narrative intent had been carved away. When the unrated cut eventually surfaced, it reframed the story entirely. The restored brutality revealed the satire's true shape, turning moments that once felt merely shocking into purposeful commentary. The studio wanted control. The MPAA wanted safety. Verhoeven wanted truth. The version released was none of these things in full, only the result of a three-way struggle. Fact 9. Blade Runner. 1982. Few films have been reshaped as drastically and as famously against a director's wishes as Blade Runner. Ridley Scott crafted a hypnotic, dream-logged noir steeped in ambiguity. But test audiences struggled with its elliptical storytelling, and the studio panicked. Their solution was drastic: reassemble the film into something clearer, brighter, and far less enigmatic. They inserted a voice-over narration that Scott loathed, turning mystery into explanation. They stitched on a forced happy ending using leftover scenic footage completely disconnected from the film's tone. They trimmed or rearranged scenes that emphasized existential doubt, fearing they would alienate viewers. The result was a version that technically followed the plot but drained it of its uneasy poetry. For years, whispers persisted about Scott's true vision. Work prints leaked, critics debated inconsistencies, and fans speculated on missing material. When the director's cut and later the final cut finally emerged, they exposed how drastic the studio's alterations had been. Gone were the spoon-fed explanations. Restored were the silences, the riddles, the unsettling fragments of imagery. The theatrical version may have been the one audiences first encountered, but the film Scott intended had been waiting beneath it like a submerged truth. Fact 10. The Killer, U.S. Cut. When The Killer made its journey from Hong Kong to American distributors, it emerged as a different creature, one reshaped not by its director, John Woo, but by editors aiming to mold it into something they believed American audiences could digest. Woo's original cut flowed like a tragic aria, slow emotional builds, lingering glances, and balletic gunplay that carried the weight of wounded honor. But when Miramax stepped in, those rhythms were disrupted. Key emotional exchanges between Ah Jong and Inspector Lee were shortened or removed altogether, weakening the moral tension that anchors the story. Action sequences crafted with Woo's signature operatic cadence were tightened until the choreography lost its melodic precision. Even the score was altered in places, replacing Woo's tonal contrasts with more conventional cues. The result was a cut that preserved the film's plot but stripped it of its heart. Woo's frustration was no secret. Fans who grew up with the US version felt something missing, though many couldn't articulate what. It wasn't until international prints circulated that viewers discovered a stark contrast. The original Hong Kong version pulsed with emotional gravity, while the American release felt clipped, hurried, and oddly muted. The US cut wasn't an adaptation, it was a distortion. It translated the film into a language it was never meant to speak. Fact 11. On Deadly Ground. 1994. On Deadly Ground was Steven Seagal's attempt to craft an action film with a message, one rooted in indigenous culture, environmental destruction, and the moral responsibility of those who exploit the earth. His director's cut reportedly delivered this vision with extended sequences exploring spiritual themes and cultural nuance. But the studio saw danger in its earnestness. They feared audiences would find the tone too heavy, too political, too strange. So they cut nearly half an hour of material. Entire conversations meant to ground the story in Alaskan culture disappeared. Emotional bridges connecting scenes were removed, making transitions feel abrupt. The moral foundation that Seagal believed necessary was thinned into a series of gestures rather than ideas. What remained was an action film with glimpses of a deeper story, glimpses that never had the chance to grow. Critics panned the theatrical version, often blaming Seagal's direction for its unevenness. What most didn't know was that the imbalance came from choices the director didn't make. Industry insiders spoke of a significantly longer assembly screen before the intervention, one that tied the film's action to its themes with greater coherence. But no official release has ever presented that version. The finished film wasn't a failure of ambition. It was a casualty of the studio's fear of that ambition. Fact 12. Highlander 2. 1991. Few sequels have suffered as violent an identity crisis as Highlander 2. The production was plagued with financial turmoil, script changes, and forced rewrites. But the most dramatic shift occurred in the editing room, where director Russell Mulcahy lost control entirely. Producers seized the film before he could shape it, rearranging scenes, discarding crucial exposition, and leaving behind a cut so incoherent that it became infamous. Mulcahy's intended version explored a more cohesive mythology, clarifying the origins of the immortals and connecting character motivations with emotional clarity. But the studio's version scrambled timelines, altered motivations, and undercut the dramatic arc. Fans were left with a film that felt chaotic rather than ambitious, its narrative logic shattered by hands that did not understand the material. Mulcahy reportedly walked out of the premiere, so horrified by what he saw that he refused to stay another minute. For years, fans clamored for the director's intended version. Eventually, the Renegade cut emerged, assembled from recovered footage and alternate takes. It didn't transform the film into a masterpiece, but it restored enough missing pieces to reveal the vision buried underneath. Two versions now exist. The one audiences endured, and the one that proves the story was never meant to be what the studio forced it into. And between them lies the cost of taking a film away from its creator. Fact 13. Universal Soldier. The Return, 1999. Universal Soldier. The Return is a film that feels strangely hollow, not because its ideas were weak, but because so many of them never made it to the final cut. Director Mike Rogers set out to explore the psychological deterioration of Luc Devereaux, a man rebuilt by science, haunted by memories, and slipping between identity and programming. His original assembly leaned heavily into those internal fractures, creating a portrait of a soldier trying desperately to reclaim a self that technology kept erasing. But the studio wanted something simpler. Executives pushed for relentless action. They trimmed introspective beats that contextualized Devereaux's volatility and stripped away moments that questioned the ethics behind the Universal Soldier program. Even scenes examining SETH's evolution as an AI were shortened or rearranged to enhance spectacle rather than narrative weight. The result was a movie driven by noise, not tension. Rogers hinted in interviews that a more emotionally grounded cut existed, one where Devereaux's unraveling was the spine, not the background. But that version never made it out of private screenings. Fans who sensed the disconnection between the film's ideas and its execution were unknowingly reacting to a story that had been compressed beyond recognition. What audiences were given was an action film missing the psychological pulse that once guided it. It wasn't the absence of ideas that weakened the film. It was the removal of the scenes that gave those ideas life. Fact 14. The Order, 2001. Behind The Order lies a film struggling to breathe beneath the weight of a post-production overhaul. Jean-Claude Van Damme and director Sheldon Lettich originally crafted a story steeped in mysticism, ancient secret societies, and a protagonist wrestling with faith as much as violence. Their first assembly reportedly leaned into historical references, ritual symbolism, and character arcs designed to reveal a man spiraling through layers of spiritual conflict. But the studio feared the movie felt too esoteric. In response, entire sections of the narrative were carved away. Scenes that explained the sex mythology disappeared. Emotional bridges that established Van Damme's motivations were trimmed into fragments. Action sequences were repositioned earlier in the story, giving the film the pace of a chase instead of the slow-burning mystery Lettich intended. Even the order of revelations was reshuffled, leaving some moments feeling abrupt or incomplete. Lettich later acknowledged that the theatrical cut bore only partial resemblance to what he and Van Damme envisioned. Fans have long pointed out tonal inconsistencies, mystery without setup, action without build-up, symptoms of a film assembled for speed rather than coherence. What remained was a hybrid, a spiritual thriller gutted of its context and reconfigured into something more conventional. The heart of the story wasn't lost, it was removed, piece by piece, in the cutting room. Fact 15. SWAT, 2003. The theatrical cut of SWAT functions well as a mainstream action film, but beneath its polished surface lies a drastically pared-down character drama. Director Clark Johnson initially shot the film as a tense portrait of elite officers grappling with discipline, ego, and evolving loyalties. His early edit highlighted the psychological demands of SWAT training, the fatigue, the friction, the silent rivalries shaping every decision. But the studio wanted something lighter, faster, and more accessible. They trimmed scenes that explored internal team politics, removed beats that established the gravity of tactical decision-making, and shortened sequences showing the mental strain placed on officers. Johnson's intention was to ground the film in realism, showing how precision and pressure collide in high-risk operations. But the final cut shifted emphasis towards set-piece action, sanding away nuances that once made the characters feel heavier and more complicated. Reports from the time indicate Johnson fought to preserve several emotional threads, particularly the deteriorating mentor-student relationship at the story's core, but many were condensed or excised outright. Critics later described the film as competent but thin, unaware that its missing density lay on the editing room floor. What audiences received was a streamlined version of a far more layered narrative. The film didn't lack depth, it was edited until the depth no longer showed. Bonus fact: the vault nobody talks about. Every so often, someone who once worked deep inside a studio's post-production department lets slip a fragment of a story, never the whole thing, just enough to unsettle whoever hears it. They describe a film that supposedly passed through the editing pipeline decades ago, a project that arrived with a complete director's cut before quietly vanishing. No official record lists it. No archivist has ever acknowledged it. But according to those whispers, the studio locked the movie away before anyone outside the building ever saw a single frame. The tales always contain the same details. A cut too uncompromising, too bleak, too honest for the executives backing it. A version filled with performances that hit uncomfortably close to truth. Scenes that challenged the genre's boundaries. Moments that made the studio nervous not because they were flawed, but because they revealed something raw about the world the film inhabited. The director fought for it, they say, screened it for a handful of staff, and then, without warning, the reels were pulled, labeled, sealed, and stored in a climate-controlled archive beneath a different project's code name. Some insist the footage still exists. Others claim it was destroyed to avoid legal complications. And then there are those who believe the cut has become a ghost passed around in rumor form, surviving only in private recollections and half-remembered anecdotes from people who were never supposed to talk. What makes the legend so persistent is the possibility that a complete, untouched director's vision lies in the dark somewhere, waiting for someone to rediscover it. A version of a film that might change everything we think we know, not because it was famous, but because it was never allowed to be. If that lost cut ever resurfaced, what truth would it expose? If this journey through hidden edits and buried cuts left you with more questions than answers, that's exactly where the truth of filmmaking often lives. Tell us in the comments which story changed the way you see these movies and which recut you believe deserves to surface next. And if you want to keep exploring the unseen corners of action cinema, remember to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next deep dive. Which lost version do you think would completely reshape the film if it ever emerged?